Welcome to Knitting 201, a virtual class with Rolling Hills Library in St. Joseph, Missouri. Our instructor again this evening is Crafting Queen, Jennifer Stover. So Jennifer, welcome and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anali. Thank you, Rolling Hills, for having the opportunity to put on an event for Rolling Hills, especially with knitting, which is a strong passion of mine. Would like to go ahead and we're going to start with Knitting 201. So in our first lesson, we learned how to knit. We learned how to cast on. We learned about some of our resources and some of the tools that we need, and also how to read a yarn ball. Tonight we're going to learn how to do the purl stitch. We're going to learn how to change colors. We're going to learn how to wind yarn. And we're also, I'll do a brief example of how to block your project once it's completed. So then that way it's the right size for you for what you need, and it'll make your stitches look nice and great. So with that, let me go ahead and show you our project that we're working today. And it's going to be this basket weave dishcloth. There's two stitches that we have. One is our knit, and then we also go to purl. The nice thing about a basket weave pattern is that it is completely reversible. So what you see on one side is what you're going to see on the other side, which makes it nice. So there's no wrong side at all. So as we get started, I'm going to actually teach you a new cast on. And our cast on method we learned last time was called the knitted cast on. So we were learning how to knit right from the get-go. Tonight I'm going to show you what is called the long tail cast on. The long tail cast on is a stretchier cast on. It's also makes for a cleaner edge. As you can see, we don't have the loops like we did in our first one with the knitted cast on. They do call it a long tail because you need to have a length of yarn because you're going to use twice the amount of yarn for this initial cast on. So what I'm going to do today, we're going to learn how to do a cast on, and then we're going to practice the purl stitch right from the get-go, and then we can rip out our project, and then we'll start our basket weave pattern. So the first thing you'll need to do when you're getting ready to cast on is, of course, you're going to need your yarn. And I usually measure like the length of my arm from where I hold it at the tip to the crook of my elbow is about 20 stitches. I learned that just because I cast on 20 stitches one time and I pulled it out, and that's how I did my measuring. That's a great way, especially if you have to cast on like 100 stitches. You can use your body parts as measuring tools, and I love that. And so, like how they always say your thumb, that's about an inch. I'll use the palm of my hand, that's about 6 inches. Here's about, I guess, about 10 or 12 inches right there. So it's nice that you can use your body for measurements, and I strongly suggest it because you keep that around with you all the time. So for our cast on tonight, we're just going to cast on about 20 stitches just to get our practice. So I'm just going to hold it from the tips of my fingers to the crook of my elbow. And from there, we're going to make a slip knot. So just make a slip knot right at that point. How I showed you last time, it was just to wrap your yarn around. You can make an X by taking the older stitch and passing it over. And then you're going to take the new stitch or the new back stitch, pass it over that string and over your finger, and then you're going to pull. So again, and you can pull it out if you don't like it. Wrap it around your finger twice. Take the stitch in the back or string in the back, pass it over your finger. Take the new string, pass it over your finger and over the string, and then pull both strings. And then as you can see, I have 2 stitches with a slip knot. And we're just going to go ahead and put our slip knot on the needle, on one of your needles, and you can pull tight. Again, you don't want to choke it too much. You still want to make sure it's nice and loose. When you do this cast on, of course, you have two sides, one that's your tail and another one that's actually connected to your ball. You want to have your tail closest to your heart. So if you need to switch your slip knot, you can certainly do that. So then that way my tail's closest to me. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take your tail and you're going to split them with your fingers. So if you want to like peek between the curtains with your thumb and your index finger, and then you're going to take the rest of your fingers and you're going to grab the two stitches. So we're essentially kind of making a hole. So we're going to take your fingers and spread the tails, and then you're going to grab the rest of your hands and you're going to hold the string. So then that way they're not going anywhere. And then you're going to hold your yarn with your index finger, and then pull your yarn down. So you're going to make like an Eiffel Tower, upside down Eiffel Tower. So again, just a reminder, we're going to peek between the curtains. We're going to grab the yarn underneath to hold it tight. And then we're going to bring our needle down to make an Eiffel Tower, an upside down Eiffel Tower. And then we have these two loops here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go under our thumb. Make sure I don't split the yarn. Under our thumb. Let's see, sorry, let me try that again here. And it sometimes helps if you're too far down, your string gets loose. So if you find that, go ahead and get a little closer to the tip or closer to your slip knot, and then reach around, and then you can pull down. So I'm going to go under my thumb, around the first string of my index finger, and we're going to go through that hole, and then you can take your thumb off and you're going to pull. So if you remember our nursery rhyme on how we learned how to knit, it was in through the front door, go around back, out through the window, and off jumps Jack. So we're going to learn that same technique with this cast on. So again, we're going to peek through and we're going to grab our yarn and go down. So it's like we go in through the front door. So we're going to go under our thumb into the house, go around back. So we're going to wrap it around this first stitch and see how our yarn is laying over like we did our knitted cast on. Then we're going to go out through the window. So now we're just going to go right through that hole, and off jumps Jack. So then you can just drop your thumb and then you can pull. And then you can take your strings and then you can kind of like wiggle it and adjust it and tighten it up. So then that way, with every stitch on your hook or on your needle, of course, the first one was a slip knot, but that does count as a stitch. So right now I have 3 stitches on my needle. So again, we're going to peek through and grab the yarn. And if you want to use your index finger to hold it down, and then you're going to pull your needle down below your hand so you can create those loops. And then again, we're going to go in through the front door. So we're going to go under our thumb, around the first string, and then you can just go straight down into your thumb. And so you don't have to reset all the time. You can actually just drop your thumb and then use your thumb underneath to pull your yarn. So that way you don't have to drop your hands every single time. Of course, if you do, that's perfectly fine. You'll find some shorter tips and tricks as you go along to feel more comfortable. So now I have 4 stitches. So you're going to peek through again, peek through the curtains, and then grab the legs and bring your yarn down. So go in through the front door. You're going to go around back, out through the window, and off jumps Jack. And I'm just going to use my thumb to tighten it. Now, if it's kind of awkward with your right hand and your left hand doing it, you can certainly switch. I'm technically I'm a lefty. I knit right-handed, but sometimes my cast-ons are opposites. So what feels comfortable for me, if that looks awkward, you can certainly do it with this other hand, where if you use your right hand to peek through and then grab, same concept, go down. And as you can see, I make 2 loops. You can go under, around, through, and off. So same concept, whichever way you do it. And then go ahead and just go until you run out of yarn. Of course, when you do a project, you always want to make sure you have about 5 or 6 inches remaining, but sometimes I've gotten to 2 or 3 inches, and because I don't want to redo my cast on, so you just have a tight weaving of your ends if that's the case. But usually you want to give yourself a little, when you pull for your yarn, give yourself a little extra just in case for that slack. And of course, the bigger the needle, the more yarn you use. So my rule of going to the inside of your arm may not count for 20 stitches. It may only count for like 10. So that's something that you can feel comfortable with doing. Once you measure one time, you can figure that out, or just pull a whole bunch of yarn out. So go in, around, through, to off. And as you can see, we're starting to get some stitches on our needles, and they look just like the stitches when we cast on last time. So every loop counts as a stitch. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So do it again. And it's nice to kind of work to the top, close to your stitch, and then you can certainly adjust your yarn if you need more just by loosening up your hand. So in, around, through, and off. And then you can start getting faster when you feel more comfortable. Of course, as you get towards the end, your yarn just kind of comes out of your hand, so you kind of have to work in smaller loops if you want. I'm just going to cast on, let's see how many I have to cast on. 3, 6, 9, 12, 13, 14. I'm just going to cast on 15 for today. And then once you've cast on, of course, it looks just like our regular knitting. And what we're going to do then is take our yarn, move it to our left hand, and we're ready to start knitting or purling across to do your project. So what we're going to do, we have the knit stitch down pretty well, which is you go in, around, through, and off, and we keep our yarn to the back. With purling, we actually are going to keep our yarn in the front. That means that it's going to create our bumps in front of us rather than behind. And there's actually a nursery rhyme for this one too. It goes, peek through the fence, grab the sheep, back through the fence, and off we leap. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our yarn and we're going to make sure our yarn is in front of our right hand needle. And so instead of going in this way, we're going to go from the right to the left. So we're going to go right to the left. So we're peeking through the fence. Then we're going to grab the sheep. So now we're going to wring its neck. We're going to go from the back to the front. And then we're going to go back through the fence. And if you need to, hold your yarn or hold your index finger right up there And making that T is helpful as well. So if you need to go this way, we're going to go right back through our hole. And then we're going to off we leap. We're just going to kick him right off. And of course, our first stitch is a little floppy because we have nothing to hold on to and it has nothing to connect to yet. But again, we're going to go peek through the fence. So we're going to go right to left. We're going to go into our stitch. And we're going to take our yarn, wrap it around the back. Then we're going to go back through the hole. So we're taking that loop and we're bringing it back through our hole. And then we're just going to take off our left stitch. So now we have 2 on this side and the 13 remaining here. So again, in, around, through, and off. Again, in, around, through, and off. Now, if you go around from the bottom around, you'll actually twist your stitch. So when you go back around on the other side, if you knit that same or purl that same stitch, it's going to twist it and make that stitch a little tighter. So you want to make sure that you have the extra yarn by wrapping it around from the back to the front. And then bring it through and off. Again, in, around, back, and off. And once you've got this down, this is pretty much all there is to knitting. There's really only 2 stitches in knitting. And that's why I like learning this first. With crochet, of course, there can be multiple combinations of stitches. And in knitting, there's just 2. There's the knit stitch and the purl. And technically, the purl is just a backwards knit. And I'll show you that, like if I go in here, so if I go from the back, see how I've gone in through the front door? And I go around, just like how I wrapped it around for knitting, and then back through and off. So really, purling is just a backwards knit stitch. So, and we're going to do this for just a couple of rows, just so that way you feel comfortable with this particular stitch. So we go in, around, through, and off. In, around, through, and off. And so like knitting, of course, you have a nice, pretty front end, and you have a bumpy end. But we're going to, again, purl on the other side. And if you'll notice, with your comparison of your knit garter stitch square, you're going to actually get the same fabric because you're doing the same stitch on each side, and therefore you're going to create that same ridged fabric. So again, for your yarn, when you start a row, you want to make sure for purling, your yarn is in front of your needle. So as you can see, it's in front. And then now my needle can go in, around, through, and off. How does that feel for everyone? Does that make sense? Are you feeling comfortable with this stitch? Okay. So we're going to do just a couple of rows, and then I'm going to have you rip out your project, and then we'll start the basket weave. I wanted you to do a couple of rows of just purling only, just so you understand the purling concept. So then that way the transition between the knitting and the purling stitches on the same row won't be so overwhelming. So in, around, through, and off. And then if you start getting towards the last couple of stitches and your stitches start feeling flimsy, of course, use your index finger. You can hold your stitches in place until you get them off. And around, through, and off. And that edge stitch is always going to be a little floppy because it doesn't have anything on the other side to hold it to, but that's perfectly fine. So now as you can see, I have bumps on this side. I also have bumps on this side as well. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm just going to take these off my needle and say goodbye. So now I'm going to what they call frogging. I'm just going to pull it out, or I'm going to rip it. I'm going to rip it. If you undo one stitch at a time, it's called tinking. So it's the word knit spelled backwards because you're undoing one stitch at a time. But for mine, I'm just ripping it all out. So I'll even do the slip knot. So I'm still going to do 15 stitches. What we're going to do, and we're going to actually knit and purl on both sides, so it creates our thing. So for my practice swatch for training, I'm just going to do 15 stitches. I've grouped them in clusters of 5, so it's only going to be this amount. So again, my slip knot, wrap it around twice, pass it over again, and pull. When you get ready to knit or purl with this yarn, you always want to make sure, because you have a long tail, that you don't start knitting with your tail end, because you're going to find that you're going to run out of yarn really fast. So I'm going to slip my stitch here. That way my tail is closest to my heart. I'm going to peek through the curtain and grab the legs. And then I'm going to go back under again. So this is good practice too, to go ahead and get your cast on. There's several different types of cast on, and you'll find that you may like one more than the other. I like the long tail cast on method when I do a lot of my projects. But if you find that it's not one of your favorites, you can certainly do the knitted cast on method. You can also look for cast on books. The library should have one, and that will give you some different designs. They'll show pictures, and each one will give you a different type of finished edge. Some of them will also give you live stitches. So if you're doing something in the round, you'll be able to pick it up and make a seamless project without knowing where you started or ended. Because as you can see, I have a seam, and sometimes that bump, it's more noticeable, and you may not want that. I'm just casting on right now, and around, through, and off. And as you can see, I'm just taking my thumb off and then using that to pull the yarn to tighten. And then since I've tightened it, when I wrap it around, my thumb is automatically in position for the next stitch. So I never really have to take my thumb off of my project and reset. And through, off. 3, 6, 9, 12. Do 3 more stitches. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so with this project, I also encourage, especially to count. after every single stitch or every single section. That way you won't be off and your baskets won't won't be lopsided. And a great way to help you count is with stitch markers. You can use them in your project at every juncture. So then that way you know that it's time to start a new stitch. That would be a good practice. So I'm going to do a couple of those with my project here, just so you see how that works. So I have my 15 stitches, and I'm going to now move them onto my left side of my needle. And we're going to start with the knit stitch. So I'm going to do 5 stitches in knit, and then I'm going to rotate and then do 5 stitches in purl, and then 5 stitches in knit again. For the basket weave, I always like symmetry. So I always try to do them where kind of a grouping is 10. If you look at this, this takes 5 and this takes 5. And then I add on an additional 5 stitches. So then that way I have a symmetrical pattern. You can certainly, do it in groups of 10 if you want, but then your end would be a little different. And my OCD, or I like to call it CDO because I put it in alphabetical order, I just like to have the finish edge where both ends are the same. But it's entirely up to you. But we're going to do it in groups of 10 plus an additional 5 stitches. So if you want to make your project bigger or smaller, that's how you know for your math grouping. So the first thing we're going to do is 5 knit stitches. So again, as a refresher, we're going to go in through the front door from the left to the right, go around back, out through the window, and off jumps Jack. So that's 1 stitch right there. And there's my tail. And we don't have to worry about our tail, we just set it aside. So in, around, through, and off. Kind of has the same cadence as purling, which is nice. So kind of once you get that motion, it's pretty soothing. So in, around, through, and off. So I have 4 stitches. I'll do it again, in, around, through, and off. So now I have 5 stitches. So I'm going to put in a stitch marker. When we talked about stitch markers previously, there are 2 different types of stitch markers. One, there's a closed loop one. This one has a little bead. So this actually came from one of my daughter's necklace charms that she thing, and I turned into a stitch marker. I stole it from her and ended up just making a little wire loop, and then I stuck a bead in where the seam is and did a little glue. So you can make really simple stitch markers. You also have the locking stitch markers as well, and these are ones that just like little safety pins. These are the bell-shaped ones. But you can use regular safety pins. You can use some of those loom rubber bands. You can use just scraps of yarn if you want to. So don't feel like you have to go out and buy something. You can even use twist ties from bread bags. So there's definitely lots of useful tools that don't cost any money or very minimal money. So don't feel like you have to go out and buy all the accessories, even though they are fun, I must admit. So I have 5 stitches, and now I'm going to put a stitch marker on my needle. So this one's just my closed loop one. So you see that? And I'm just going to lay it over there. Now I'm going to transfer to the purl stitch. Now this can be a quick way to create an extra stitch, so we have to be careful how we transfer our yarn. If we wrap it around, as you can see, I've just created an extra stitch, and I don't want that. So we're actually going to now bring our yarn between the 2 stitches. And then now our yarn is in front, and we can start to purl. So now I'm going to go in from the right to the left. And as you can see too, because your yarn's in front, your needle automatically wants to just go in there. So it should go pretty smoothly. But we're going to do that 5 times now. So we're going to go in, around, remember, back to front, and then go back through and off. And we're going to go in, around, through, and off. So right now I have, and if you need to space it, remember our stitch marker, it doesn't count as a stitch, it's just a spacer. 1, 2, 3, 2 more. 4. And 5. So now I'm going to be knitting the next round. So I'm going to put on a stitch marker. And then I'm going to wrap my yarn. Remember, we're not going to wrap it just to the back because that'll create an extra stitch. We need to bring it through our needles, between both of our needles, and to the back because we want our bumps in the back now. So now then we can start knitting. And sometimes if the stitch marker is a little ornery, you may have to shift it just so it's not in your way. So now you can go in. And remember, as we knit, we want to knit on the fattest part of our needle, not on the tapered part, because that will make a distorted stitch or make it too tight for our next round. So go in, around, through, and off. In, around. In, around, through, and off. Okay, and here's my last stitch. And as you can see, I still have 15 stitches. I have 2 markers, and that's showing when my stitches change. But then you can also look at your yarn, even on this first row where there's not much, and you can see the difference. So as you can see, I have stitches here and here that do not have bumps. They're more flat, and my middle section have the bumps. And if I reverse it, which I'm going to because I'm going to start my next row, now I have the bumps and then a flat section and a bumps. And because we're wanting to create a basket weave, we're wanting to create some of the same pattern. If you've ever heard the adage, you're going to knit your knits and purl your pearls. This is where it comes into play. Pearls, I always think of as little oyster pearls. So think of the little bumps as little oysters. So here's our pearls, here's our bumps. Knitting, I think of as a neck, or you can think of as a noose. And if you see that, like if you look at the top of your stitch, pretend this is its head, and then around it, just below it, is a scarf that's wrapped around its head. So that's your knit stitch, or your neck stitch if you want to think of it this way. So we know we're going to purl because we see these bumps. So now we're going to start with our purl row. So the yarn is going to go in the front of the needle. So put your needle in the back, and we're going to automatically go in right to left, wrap around, through and off. In, around, through and off. Okay. So now I'm to my first stitch marker. As you can see, we can do a quick count. I still have 5 stitches. If we had 6 stitches, then this would be a good and a quick time to realize we need to find out what we did wrong. A lot of times at the beginning, we may have started with our yarn in the back, and then when we brought it around, it created an extra stitch. Or if we transferred it between the 2 stitches and created the yarn. If that's the case, just drop off the yarn. It'll be okay. There'll be a little bit of a gap, but it'll correct itself in the next row. So now that we have the stitch marker, we're not going to knit it. We're just going to pass it over. So we're just going to take it, and we're just going to pass it over to our right needle. So now we know we're getting ready to knit, because there's our little head and there's our little scarf, there's our little fella. So to knit, we need to go in the back. So we need to take our yarn, wrap it between our needles, and go in the back. So now we're going to start left to right. Also make sure with a stitch marker, you don't wrap it around your stitch marker either, because that would create more of a loose fabric. So if you need to, just kind of reposition your stitch marker so it's out of the way, so you don't accidentally make more yarn between those stitches, because if so, you'll create a ladder or extra yarn, so it won't be as tight and clean. So now I'm just going to knit these center stitches. Okay, so I have 5 stitches that I've just knit. I have another stitch marker. I can just take it, stick it on my other needle, pass it over. I'm going to flip this to the front. And so now, what am I going to do? I see purls. I see my bumps. So now I'm going to purl. So I'm going to take my yarn, and I'm going to bring it between both of my needles. And now I'm going to start the purling process. And around, through and off, and around. And as you can see, I do like to work kind of like the T I mentioned. And I keep my needles close together, because then that runs less risk of the stitch falling off. And then I also pull my yarn down, so that way there's some more tension, and it's a lot less likely to kind of flop off as well. Okay, so now I've created the second row, and as you can see, I have a few more bumps, I have a few more knits, and if I turn it around, now I have just the inverse, where now my knit stitches are in front and my purls are in the middle, and then the knit stitches are on the edge. So now we're going to do it again, and we're going to knit it until, or we're going to keep the same pattern going until we make a square. And you'll be able to see a little bit by, you can either fold it over or you can do a measurement. Like I said, I like to use my hands as my body parts as measuring tools. So as you can see, my thumb is about 1 inch for my knitting. So when it gets the length here, then that's when I know I can stop. Purl or knit stitches are actually shorter than they are wide. So even though I knit 5 across, I'm not going to knit for 5 rows. It'll still be too short. So we need to probably create either 1 more row or 2 more rows, depending on the yarn you have. So we're just going to, here I have a knit stitch, so I'm going to knit, and my yarn is in the back. 2, 3, 4, 5. And then now I'm getting ready to purl. I'm going to bring my yarn to the front. I'm going to slip my stitch marker. I have had it happen in the past where I haven't slipped it, or I thought I did, and I knit it together. If you knit it together and you don't have a locking stitch marker, then you're going to have to sacrifice the stitch and you're going to have to cut it out, because now it's officially knitted into your fabric. So just be careful. If it's just easier to use one with like a safety pin all the time, or if not, just be aware that you're just moving the stitch marker from the left to the right. Now here I have my bumps, so I'm going to purl. 2, 3, 4, 5. Going to pass this stitch marker over. And as you can see, I'm getting ready to knit now because I have, here's my neck, and then there's my scarf around it. So I'm going to bring my yarn back between the 2 stitches, or between the 2 needles, and now I can knit. And this is a great way to make different patterns. You don't have to do a basket weave if you don't want. You can make ribbing. Ribbing is essentially just knit 1 stitch, purl 1 stitch, knit 1 stitch, purl 1 stitch, and it's going to create a nice stretchy fabric. Of course, this one, since it has more stitches between, you're not going to see that stretch, but especially in like sleeves for sweaters or hems, you're going to see that ribbing. Hats are another great example. And so you can see it gives a little more stretch where a regular knit fabric would just lay flat and just contour to your body. So there's different combinations of knitting and purling in the same row. You can also make pictures or patterns out of it by shapes. So if you wanted to make a circle, you can do that, or a star or a square. Now here again, I have all my bumps here. So that's my purl. That tells me I'm purling. So again, yarn in front of my needle, and then I go right to left. It's nice to start with geometric patterns first when you play, because it's kind of more of a pixel type shape and style, and easier to switch between the 2 before you start really getting into more curvature styles and shapes. So now I'm switching to knit. And I know I'm switching to knit because I have my stitch marker to tell me. Or if you didn't want to use a stitch marker, you can just count. After 5 stitches, I know I'm going to knit. But then you can also see the shape of your fabric when it changes that style. So there's different ways to read your knitting with using stitch markers, just looking at the texture of your fabric by counting. So I'm going to pass that over, and I'm going to purl. Okay, so now let's learn how to count our rows. When we just do a garter stitch, whether we purl every row or we knit every row, we created ridges in our first one. But now we're actually creating legitimate stitches that you can see. Now this first stitch, this first area, this was our cast on, and it looks like a knit stitch, but we don't actually count that as our first stitch. We're actually going to count the row above, and we count our V's. So you want to make sure you see a V, so a V, not the upside down. So this is our stitch, and if you spread it apart, you can see the head is the center of all these stitches. So to count, we're just going to count our V's. So we have 1, 2, 3 stitches, and we have a stitch here. It's still a working stitch, but technically that is our 4th row. So we've done 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. And we're not quite square yet. As you can see, it's a little bit of a rectangle. So we're going to knit probably 2, maybe even 3 more rows. So I'm knitting now. There's no bumps in front this time. I'm just knitting my knits and purling my purls. That way all the stitches are the same. If you knit your purls and you purl your knits, you create a texture which is called seed stitch. So you still have bumps on every side, but they're staggered. But I'll let you play with that type of technique for another day. Okay, so finished. We're going to pass it between. Slip my stitch marker. Complete. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we're getting somewhat square, but still just off. So we've completed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's try a 6th row and see if that squares us up a little more. Of course, if you want to make rectangular stitches, you can certainly do that. You can also do different widths of your blocks. So you could do 5 stitches, and then you could do maybe two stitches or 3 stitches of the opposite stitch. So that would create a different texture or a different style. The closer your knit and your purls are together, the stretchier your fabric would be. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So as you can see now, that's actually pretty square. I could fold it up if I wanted to. And it pretty much makes a nice triangle. So I'm going to say that I have officially reached my square size that I would like to do. And I've made 6 rows. So that will be something to do a mental count every time. So now we're going to create our basket. And as you can see, we've created our first sections here. So now we need to do the opposite, so we create that new texture on top. So where normally when we would continue, we would start with our knitting. Now we're going to create our bumps in the front, so now we're going to purl. So now we're just going to start opposite of what we did earlier. And now we're just going to purl 5 stitches. And again, knitting's just the 2 stitches, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. And what you do with those 2 types of stitches, the combination you make, will create the type of fabric. So now I'm going to pass this over. And now I'm going to knit. And especially this first row, when you start to change the design, you can kind of doubt yourself because you're looking, it's like, wait, I've been purling this whole time. So just be sure to read your stitches, what you did before. You can see a purl, so I know I'm going to be knitting here. And I'm going to bring it to the front. Something looks a little off here. I wonder what I did. If you notice, when I was getting ready to go through, this is a very loose stitch. So I need to see what I did. So I'm just going to undo this one stitch by going underneath, pulling it off. I'm going to do it again. So let me look what I did. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches. So what I can see is that I must have done some yarn over somewhere. Because if I count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, oh, I was supposed to have 6. So my stitch didn't actually complete. When I yarned over, I ended up not completing that stitch. And it looks like I did that 2 times. So we can correct that I'm going to knit this first stitch, or I'm sorry, purl, and I'm going to purl that stitch again. So now this stitch really should be stitch number 6. So I'm just going to take that stitch off. And then, actually, I guess I didn't have to take it off. I'm just going to take this stitch and pass it over. So therefore it's laying on top. Now I can purl it. And it looks like I need to do this one too. So I'm just going to take this stitch and pass it. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches. So I'm back on. And just remember, even though the cast on, it's a V as well, that does not count as a stitch. So purl and purl. And then just to be on the safe side, so I know I still have 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So stitch markers are another great saving grace with counting, and also counting each section that you do for a while is really good to keep you on track so you don't have additional stitches in your pattern. So as you can see, it's starting to take shape, my new row. So now I'm going to knit. I pass this over. Okay, I'm sorry, Teresa, you're having issues, but yes, Rolling Hills will have the video afterwards, and you can certainly access this video when on YouTube when it's processed. So I hope you'll be able to join us and watch it again. If you get a chance to stay on, please feel free to, or try to log back in. Okay. Okay, so that's the same concept we're getting. Now that you know that how we're alternating our stitches between knitting and purling, how you're starting to create the different design, you're starting to create the basket. So really those are the only stitches. So I want to show you how to play around with it a little more. What I want to show you next is how to change colors. So I've started a little swatch initially, same item. This one, of course, has 20 stitches instead. So see how, I start with a knit and it ends up in a purl. So it just kind of throws you off a little bit, but it looks completely fine. And of course, it's still reversible. So I want to change colors, and you can do this, at each section. You can either do it at each block, you can do it in each grouping, you can do them, even in the middle if you wanted to. So there's a couple of different ways you can there's a couple of different ways you can do your colors. If you have a project that's not reversible, that you only want to have the bad side only on one side, you're going to knit all the way across. You're going to ignore the stitch pattern that we have. So even though I have purl, actually I'm starting a new grouping, so I'm going to start with knit this next round. Even though I may knit and then purl and knit and purl, if I only want the bad side of the yarn, and let me show you, I'm only going to knit all the way across. But if I just want to join my yarn and continue in my pattern, actually I'll show you that first. So to start a new color, you can just drop your old yarn and you can cut it if you want, leaving a 6-inch tail. And then you're going to start a new yarn. So again, leaving about a 6-inch tail so you have room to weave in or knot your yarns. I'm going to start with the knit stitch because here was my knit. Here was kind of my purl cluster. Now I'm going to start with the knit again. So I'm going to put my needle in, and now I'm going to take my new yarn and I'm just going to lay it over my stitch. So as you can see, it's not anchored right now, it's just laid over, and you're just going to pull it through. And that's it. It's really simple to join your yarn. It's still loose, so we don't want to pull our yarns quite yet. We're going to go ahead and put our next stitch in. Going to take your yarn, make sure it's not your tail because you'll run out of yarn really fast. But you're going to take it and wrap it around. So now it should be locked. It's not going to go anywhere. The first stitch may be a little loose or floppy, and you can just kind of pull that string. But I'll show you kind of the two ways here. So if I follow in pattern, so I've done my 5 stitches, and now I'm going to take my yarn and purl. And this is also the same way you would join even if you're using the same color. So you run out of yarn in your first ball and you want to use your new ball. It's the same concept. You just wouldn't see as visibly. So you're going to go wrap around. Okay. So if you notice, see how when I join my yarn and I purl in my pattern, you can see both of the colors at the same time. Where here, you don't see any colors, but it's on the back side. So if I wanted to make my pattern where I definitely have a right side and a wrong side, or a pretty side and a not so pretty side, just ignore the patterning. So see how I purled here. These last 2 stitches, 2 sections, I'm just going to knit across. I'm going to pretend that there is no pattern here. So I'm just going to knit all the way across. And this will still count as 1 row when you do your count before you go to your next cluster section. But as you can see now, I have really nice stitches over here on the face. You know, this one's a little ugly on this side. But now all of my wrong stitches are on this side. So now I know that this is my not so nice side. But here now, after I do the first row of the color change, you can go back to your pattern. So I'm going to, this one was the knit, this is the purl, I'm going to knit. Four, 5, I'm going to purl. Five, going to now knit in between. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'm going to purl one last time. And as you can see, because the stitches really are kind of loose, they may feel a little bigger, and that's okay. Just go ahead and knit them. And then you may just have to tighten them. As you can see, you just kind of pull. And then you may have to pull your old yarn just to tighten that up. So when I bring it back around, as you can see, look, that I have kind of a nice, clean transition. And then there's my kind of distorted transition. So because this is reversible, it really doesn't matter. If you wanted to just follow in pattern, then you'll just have the seams on both sides. But if you want a nice clean transition, just knit the first color change, knit all the way across, and then you'll see you will have a transition on one side, but one side will be a little nicer. Okay. So I'm just going to do one more row, and then I'm going to show you how to bind off in pattern. So when I showed you how to bind off in knitting, it's going to be the same concept, but if you did the knitting all the way across, you would find that it just wouldn't look as nice and as clean, because all this front stitch would go all the way across, and so it wouldn't keep your pattern as clean up at the top. So let me just, oh wait, one more knit. See, this was a nice transition because I'm like, oh, see, this is the difference between these two stitches right here. There's my knit stitch because it has my neck, and then there's my bump. So I know to follow my stitches. Okay. I'm going to knit because of the transition. So I don't even need my stitch markers in this one, because I can see when my fabric changes. And you can also feel it with your texture. So if you see people who don't look at their projects when they're knitting, they can use their thumb to feel the texture. I've knit in the movie theaters in the dark, and so you can do that because like, oh, I feel a bump here. My pattern, my texture changes. So you can try that, especially when you get tired. Of course, when you get tired, sometimes you make more mistakes, but try it with your eyes closed and see if you feel your texture change, if you notice that difference. Okay. So as you can see, this one just looks a little cleaner, a little smoother transition compared to this transition here. Okay, so now I'm going to bind off in pattern. So to bind off in pattern just means that you're going to follow the way your stitches are going to finish. So because these are knit, and let's say I'm done with my pattern and we're going to still bind off like we normally do. So when you bind off, you only have 2 stitches max on your right hand needle. So you knit the first 2 stitches, then you're going to take your oldest stitch or the stitch furthest away from your tip, and you're going to just pass it over. And you want to do it loosely. You don't want to do it too tight. If it goes too tight, it'll kind of start squinching up at the top, and then you'll have this nice loose fabric at the bottom and a much tighter fabric up at the top. So you want to do this loosely. So next is a net stitch. So we're going to take it and pass it off and over. That's a knit stitch. Pass it over and off. And then one more knit stitch. Over and off. Okay, so now I'm going to purl. So now I'm going to purl. I'm going to bind off purlwise. So to bind off purlwise, you're going to bring your yarn to the front, and you're going to go ahead and just purl that next stitch. And then now you're going to still take this back stitch and pass it over. Sometimes that yarn gets in the way, so if you need to move it out of the way or drop it, you can do that. Okay. And then we go again. So we have another purl. We're going to go in and purl the stitch. And then we're just going to, if you have to kind of move it out of the way, you're going to go in and pass it over. So purl, grab our yarn, pass it over. And hopefully while you've been knitting and purling, you've started to figure out what's comfortable for you to hold your yarn. Like I've mentioned in the past, I like to wrap it around my pinky, lay it over my fingers, and then wrap it around my index finger. That way I can use my pinky as a stop so I can let more yarn come out or less yarn, and then I can use my index finger to help control my yarn. There's another way you can hold your yarn, and that's Continental Style, and that's where you actually hold it in your left hand. And when you knit and purl, this can actually be easier. I'm not very good at it, so I'm not the best one to show. I do have some weaknesses, and Continental is one of those, sadly. It's easier to transition from knit to purl with Continental, because this is all you're going to have to do with your yarn, is you just bring it forward or back, where I do it English style, or it's also known as throwing. So because I'm wrapping it around, so I'm throwing my stitches. But if you're interested in learning a different way to hold your yarn, it's called Continental Style. You can certainly look it up on YouTube. There's some great resources, or knittinghelp.com. They show a way to knit Continental Style, and you end up knitting faster, and also it's an easier transition. It's less tension on your joints. So if you're up for trying something new, definitely take a look at that technique. So passing that over, that was my last purl stitch to bind off. So now I'm going back to knit. So again, pass it around between the needle, and then around 2 stitches, and pass it over. Make sure you get all the stitch. Knit. You can see the knitting is a little easier because the yarn's not right in front of the stitch. Pass it over. Okay, and then my last section here, I'm going to again bring it between the 2 needles. Purl. And then just take the older stitch and pass it right over. Okay, I'm at the last 2 stitches. So I'm going to pass the old one off. And then I have 1 stitch. Just take your scissors, cut, leaving about a 6-inch tail. And then all you have to do is just lift your needle straight out. There you go. Now, if you notice, see how the bind off, where the knit, it folds in this way, and the purling, it folds in towards the knit side. So that way it gives you kind of more of a genuine look to your stitches. And that way it's consistent. If not, the fold of that bind off would go all the way across the purl side too. And while it looks fine, this is just a cleaner look, so that way you have more of the genuine knits, and you see your genuine purls as well. So that's how you do. And as you can see, because we knit here all the way across, this is definitely more the wrong side, and this is the cleaner side. So this might be the side that you'd want to showcase, like if you do scarves. But this is a great way to do projects. You can do the same stitch and just change colors, and you can do them and make small blocks of color changes. You can do large blocks of color change, and you can create all these different styles, especially with the holidays coming up. These would make great presents to do. So pot holders, dishcloths, scarves, the world is your oyster. So the next thing I want to show you is how to block your yarn or block your project. So as you can see, this one hasn't been blocked. It's kind of lumpy. It's not really straight. My edges are really kind of wobbly. So how you block your yarn depends on your material. If you have acrylic yarn, Acrylic yarn is a type of plastic and it remembers its shape. So if you try to block it with water, and the word blocking is a term of how to set your stitches. So if you hear that word, you're going to set your stitches so they have that memory. And plastic or the acrylic yarn, it will spring back exactly how it was. It remembers its shape. So the only way to block acrylic yarn is what they call killing it, K-I-L-L-I-N-G. And you do that with high steam and close to your fabric. So you're going to melt your fibers together. After that, it's not going to move. It's going to keep it just the way you have it, but it does flatten your fibers a bit. So cotton, wools, different type of animal fibers, bamboo, linen. The ideal way to block your stitches and to block your project would be with a blocking board. And I have just a foam board here. You can also use towels. You can just fold some towels up, just something where it's padded. You can also use your bed as well because that's nice and cushy. You want something where you can put pins in. You can also use a ruler so that way you're measuring it. I also have these really handy dandy. So these are what you'd find in the sewing store, are just your regular rust-proof sewing pins, or kind of the head pins. They come in the pretty colors. You can get them as T-pins as well. Let me find one here. There's a T-pin. T-pins are nice because if you stretch your fabric and it starts lifting, this is wide enough that it's not going to pop right over the head of your needle if you do some other ones. And so those are very common. You always want to make sure they're rust proof so you don't get rust on your project. These I really love, especially if you do larger projects. It covers a larger space. And these are knit blockers. And these happen to be by Knitter's Pride. You can buy them online. I don't know if there's anybody else that makes them, but you can certainly look. But they're great because when you pin normally, if you really want to go into detail, you could pin at every section. And of course, then you end up using a lot of pins. This way, with this one, I could just take here and I could block a large section all at once. And then that way I know it's even and it's not going to be wobbly. Of course, you also want to use a ruler. I always keep talking to myself that I want to mark these into 1-inch grids. You can use grids. You can use I think sewing has those big sewing boards. Of course, they're cardboard, so you want to be careful with water. But for today, we're just going to use the pins because these are pretty common. You're going to first, before you can either do it 2 ways. One, you can soak your project and get it really wet, and then you're going to wrap it up into a towel, and then you're going to squeeze and press as much water as you can. I also just like pinning it first and then spraying it with a squirt bottle. And what this will do when you wet your project is just relax your fibers and get it into the shape you want. And for this, you don't want to overly stretch it. So how you knit is the size, kind of the ideal size. But start in the corners first. You want to make sure you grab the edge stitches. And don't go right up and down. If you can go at an angle, it's a little easier, especially if you decide to steam your yarn with like a steamer or an iron. You can get down a little lower and a little closer. But you can start with the corners first. I'm just going to eyeball it tonight, but you can kind of get an idea. You can get a ruler then at that point and really start to measure. And then as you can see, it starts to go in. So of course, the more pins you use, the straighter it will be. I'm just going to use a couple of pins here. And then make sure your fabric, it's not rolled under. So you may have to kind of be a little finicky with it and make sure it's pulled out. So as you can see, it kind of curls in. So I may have to almost do it a few more pins on the side. And then kind of fold it out. Put some pins. If you have animals that are yarn magnets, when you block and you leave it to dry, definitely put it in a room where you can close the door. I have to do that. I'll put it in a room with a fan and just put it on low just to help it dry. You don't need your project soaking because you don't want it to get moldy. But as you can see, you know, it's a pretty square piece. You just get a spray bottle and just spray it, get it nice and saturated, and then just let it sit. You don't have to flip it over. It'll dry on that. But if you see there's any parts that's, you know, kind of a little bowed, you know, go ahead and just add a few more pins to get it really straight if you want. But then and then once it's set, then it should stay until you wash it again. Sometimes some washing may shrink it up or shrivel it up, and then you would just lightly repin it again once it's come out of the washing machine, and then you can just let it air dry and you block it. So that's a basic way. You can find blocking boards in different ways and places too. If you do large projects, believe it or not, I found mine at Five Below, and they're the exercise mats. If you have little kids and you have these foam type squares, then, you know, go ahead and steal one of theirs or repurpose one of theirs. But the mats at Five Below are great because they're 2 foot by 2 foot, so you can really get a large size without having to get so many small ones and connecting them. So this is a great way to showcase your piece and really show all the wonderful stitches and the detail that you've made. And then once you've done a project, a lot of times you end up having yarn that, you know, you're kind of, it starts getting floppy and it's at its end. Find the yarn I was working on. Okay, so like I'm getting yarn that's, you know, it's starting to get floppy or tangled. You may want to wind it so that way it'll be cleaner for you later on. And there's a couple of ways that you can actually wind your yarn. I happen to like my my thumb. I'll make a center pull ball, which all the yarn that you received at the library was center pulled. So I use that with a ball winder, which I'll show you, but you can make it really easily without any equipment. Again, just your hands. And you can make a center pull ball by wrapping around your hand a few times just to create your center section. So I did it like, you know, you can do it 10 or 12 times. You can make it as big as you want. And then if you hold it and line it up with your thumb, then you can wrap around. And then you can start to cover your thumb. That one has a little knot. Just get that knot right out. There we go. So we're going to wind it around our thumb. And you want to leave your thumb in that hole. As you start building up one side, you may want to twist it. So you can take your thumb, if you hold on to that tuft of yarn, You can just kind of do a twist, and now you have more space to wrap around your yarn, your ball. And the nice thing about this is when you are done wrapping it, you have this tuft of yarn that then you can pull, and it pulls from the center, and then your ball won't flop around. So that's a great way to wind your yarn. When you start getting accessories, or you end up doing a lot of yarn, and I have, you know, I just heard wonderful news that the library actually is getting ready to buy a ball winder. So this, you know, if you have yarn, I bet they'd be happy to help you wind your own yarn if you wanted to bring it to the library. And how you use this ball winder is you're going to just kind of wrap it around this coil, and then it has little grooves, and you're going to lay your yarn around it. And then from there, it does have a directional, I don't know if it can show here. It does kind of have a direction where it tells you how to use the crank, but you just wind the yarn around. And for this, for a ball winder, you don't want to hold your yarn very tight. You just want to do it very loosely. But then you just wind until you're done with the yarn, and you can create a nice center pull ball this way as well. And you pull your yarn out, and it'll pull right from the center. So there's kind of a couple of new fun accessories for you for blocking your yarn, and also winding your yarn when you have leftovers as well. That way you can make the most use of it. So that's all the information I have to show you right now. Does anybody have any questions?
Feel free to go ahead and ask if you do. We'll just take a moment and give you a chance.
The resources that I gave you in the first class, and should have also been included in this class as well, are really great for finding patterns. So if you want to start finding and being a little more adventurous and trying different patterns, really the next type of techniques that you would learn in knitting would be the cable stitch and also a lace stitch. And really it's still knitting and purling. Lace, for example, would just be wrapping your yarn around your needle before you start knitting, so you would create a deliberate hole. And cabling is just when you swap some of your stitches on your needle, but you're still knitting. So it's just the placement of your stitches that makes the difference and creates that fun little twist in the project. But if you've mastered this knit stitch and you're comfortable with the purl stitch as well, you're off to a fantastic start, and you can definitely try your hand at some adventurous projects. So I hope this was a great intro, and that this will be a new passion of yours, just like it is for me. So thank you, Rolling Hills. Again, thank you, Anali, for hosting. I had a great time teaching, and if you have any teens that would like to learn how to knit the purl stitch, we are having a class next Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and be happy to show them. We're going to be doing the same stitch. If you have any teens that would like to learn how to crochet, we did teach the basic crochet stitches, but we're also going to make, in this crochet 201 class, we're going to make these really fun nesting bowls, and we're going to learn how to work in the round for crochet and create these cute little edges and stackable bowls. So that way we could learn how to make hats and all kinds of fun things.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And we hope that you are able to continue with this new skill. Thanks for joining us.